Alrighty, I think that's time, so we'll get started. Thank you all so much for coming. All right, so let me just get started here. Okay. Hola, my name is Tadas. I'm a software engineer who works at Mozilla, MoCo, not the foundation. I am Canadian-Lithuanian, so in addition to saying hola, I don't speak any Spanish, but we can teach you a little Lithuanian, labas, also. I'm here to talk today about AI authoritarianism and the loss of human sovereignty. This is obviously a very deep and broad topic, and there's so much to cover. So obviously I'm going to be pretty limited in what I can say, but I'm sure the rest of the blanks will be filled in throughout the rest of the seminar here. So I'm going to start with just a brief story about my grandmother, Emilia, and roughly also my grandfather. My grandmother was born in 1923 in a small village called Anykščiai. She was born at a time when Lithuania had just gained its independence from Russia after being occupied for hundreds of years. And that gave way to a sense of optimism, to a sense of energy and possibility, and seeing small villages and towns that had no running water, no electricity, very little to speak of, suddenly become modern European cities. The sad fact was both my grandparents did not realize that they were living through a period of time that was going to be so tenuous and bloody, more so than any other part in their country's history. Lithuania became part of what's been called the Bloodlands, which is the area that was wedged between Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union that witnessed tremendous amounts of death, murder, forced labor, and all sorts of other privations. My grandparents didn't expect to live the life that they lived, and they probably wouldn't have chosen it. But despite that, they fled to Canada and created a new life. The reason why I bring my grandparents up is because my grandmother grew up in a small house that had no electricity and no water. And yet when she died a couple of years ago, suddenly I was talking to her via Zoom remotely in Canada during the pandemic. And seeing the moon landings and all sorts of other periods of time where seeing technology evolve in a way that was almost indescribable and impossible to believe at the time. But additionally, like many people, my grandmother's story is not unique. Tyranny and authoritarianism are frighteningly common. We all live in a time where we feel we've been able to take for granted the fact that tyranny is often the default mode. So I want to ask some people, if somebody wants to raise their hand and offer, does it feel like things are working in our society? I want to ask, what are the things that sort of concern you most? Because I often feel there's this eerie sense that even though things are normal, we go to work, we buy our groceries, we spend time with our family and friends, but something is deeply wrong and feels wrong. Does anyone want to share?
Billionaires.
Yes, billionaires, right. Does anyone else have another thing they're concerned about or feels like it's pulling at them every single day? Some sort of uneasiness or anxiety? Yes?
Surveillance.
Surveillance. Yes, that's a big one. How much of us feel that technology is really here to help us? Right? Is it really fixing the problems that it sought out? Or are we fixing for it? So, yeah, this meme's overused, but honestly it feels like it captures our time perfectly. On one end, we're told technology's on the cusp of fixing every problem imaginable. We're going to cure cancer, we're going to do this, we're going to do that. And yet, what do we see coming from it? We see rising surveillance, billionaire profits rising. So yeah, the economy is great, the stock market is booming, AI valuations are incredible, and yet income inequality is at all-time highs. Our economies are leveraged to the hilt on AI tech, and our attention is splintered. AI slop's infesting the internet everywhere we look, and people are seemingly fired day after day over dubious claims about efficiency. So what's really going on here? What's the truth? Whose fault is this? Well, I want to start by telling you it's not you. The problem isn't us, and it's normal to be confused. Multi-billion-dollar industries are here to tell us that we are the problem, that we are only one app away, that we are only one improved efficiency due to the use of an agentic AI away from fixing ourselves so that we can be more efficient, so that we can be better, so that we can be more marketable. This is madness. Corporations want us to purchase another subscription service or buy a supplement or some app or make one more post and engage. Governments, additionally, want us to believe that there are dangerous others threatening the safety of our nation, threatening our economies, threatening the hierarchy that has been established that has maintained the status quo. They want us to believe that these problems are not really problems at all to some degree, that they're inevitable, that they're a consequence of capitalism and business as usual. So where is this utopia we've been speaking of? Well, given the conference's focus on unlearning, I'd like to introduce you to a concept called hypernormalization. It's a bit wordy, but it was originally introduced by an anthropologist named Alexei Yurchak. He named his book, Everything Was Forever Until It Was No More. And this was around the expected collapse of the Soviet Union and how it was both shocking and unsurprising for its citizens. Given the levels of confusion and deceit presented by the government at the time, he saw this as a period where he wanted to look and see how society was reacting to systems splintering and falling apart around them. Meanwhile, the West saw itself as the bastion of freedom and the rightful heir to the future, with the famed Francis Fukuyama, the economist, saying that the end of the future is here. Capitalism has won. Socialism has been defeated. So, hypernormalization focuses on the idea that normalcy permeated by a profound sense of fear, dread, or confusion continues to surface. There's a sense of spectacle and absurdity which takes place and replaces action. So, really, there's a sense of being unaware of how to disrupt the status quo, a sense of fear and a sense of anxiety, and more than anything, a dissonance with what seems to be normal while things are falling apart. We also see the sort of abandon and pretense of competence. A good example is the Chernobyl nuclear disaster. Instead of addressing the disaster as it should have been, with immediate response and admitting that the problem was a nuclear catastrophe and that the Soviet Union needed international assistance and support, Gorbachev essentially gaslit the world in telling them that there was absolutely nothing wrong. Meanwhile, this very dangerous RBMK reactor dumped hazardous toxins and radioactive waste that would affect generations. Additionally, loyalty is rewarded in this system. Individuals who are complicit in this charade receive political gain and support. Additionally, there's a flurry of contradictory information. Nothing is wrong. Everything is wrong. The Soviets are to blame. The West is to blame, etc. Ordinary citizens struggle to make sense of this. There's a barrage of information that's often hard to understand and hard to distill. By show of hands, does this sound a little familiar today? Right? Yeah, given the laughter. So now, in the AI age, we are seeing dizzying changes take place. Suddenly, almost out of nowhere. Most of us used to hear concepts like, neural networks and machine learning. Now, terms like agentic AI, open AI, enormous valuations, all of these corporations that we suddenly knew very little about are front and center in the news almost every single day at our jobs and within our communities. So the major problem with this, and the referencing hypernormalization, is that often people don't think critically when they view information. If it was easy to manipulate and deceive people in the 1980s, imagine how easy it is now. It's very easy for people to see an AI-generated video and not look at it critically and immediately respond emotionally with a sense of aggravation. And the reason I point this out is because that splintered attention and that anxiety created by hypernormalization is what self-perpetuates and feeds this problem. It makes it exponentially worse. And the problem is with AI, it's only exacerbating that. Additionally, our regulators and governments are captured by industry. They are so tantalized by the potential profits and economic impact it may offer their particular state, province, or country that they are unwilling to make difficult decisions to address regulating these major industries. And look no further than the inability to address the issues with social media. Now we're essentially in hyperdrive, where all of the same issues with social media are being further exacerbated with AI technology. The final point I really want to point out here is that the very idea of testing technology, of understanding its repercussions, and thinking thoughtfully before deploying something and giving it to the masses is heresy in Silicon Valley. The move fast and break things mentality is alive and well. And frankly, we are the ones who are on the receiving end of the experiment. It's not the tool or the technology itself that's the experiment, it's us. So, some of you might have seen the advertisements for the AI startup, if you can even call it that. There was a tremendous amount of public outcry once they finally released their Stop Hiring Humans campaign. Despite the public outcry, they raised a tremendous amount of money, being a total of $25 million. What was particularly disturbing about this campaign is that they said we are wasting human potential, and that by using our technology, you will be able to improve the lot of life of many individuals. But you know what's so insidious about this? Who is a startup or this collection of individuals to basically cast an entire part of the economy as disposable or wasteful? We've seen that the way that our economy is driven, that the gig economy is often some of people's only option to earn a revenue. And yes, it is a broken system and it is incredibly abusive of the people who operate in it. But to now say that you will outsource more of that work and displace even more people without a plan is practically evil. So what gives them the right to morally judge which people are worthy and unworthy of employment? This should not be the purview of a corporation or an industry. So additionally, we've seen newspaper articles and media come out almost daily with the frightening pace of AI-related layoffs. We're clearly not dealing with this situation in a thoughtful way to transition the integration of AI into the workplace. Instead, governments are often colluding with corporations due to their heavy investment in a lot of the AI models and the AI companies, and are not implementing thoughtful policy. Most everything you hear are efficiency bets that are good for increasing stock valuations. And again, these are bets, these aren't guarantees. So what happens when all of it comes crashing down? There's most definitely a better way to balance business needs and well-being, but that seems to be the farthest thing from the minds of shareholders. Here you can see some pretty dire layoff announcements from just 2 weeks ago that was reported by the Cabesi letter. And this sort of made its way into the news everywhere. Some of you might have seen this. Whether these are couched as cautious attitudes around the state of the economy, businesses getting lean, juicing stock prices, or automating certain jobs away with AI, the fact that this many jobs are already being displaced at this point is frightening for one reason alone. AI isn't even that good yet, right? I mean, anybody who's used OpenAI, Claude, I mean, sure, it can do some wondrous things and output a spreadsheet or maybe get a little bit of code right. I personally find it fails at quite a lot of things I try to set it to. But it's not even good yet. We're not even at the phase where AI can, at scale, dependably replace human labor. And so far, we're seeing hundreds of thousands of jobs displaced as a result. As a part of this madness, we're also seeing cases like Mia Murati's Thinking Machines startup have absolutely no product to show for it. I mean, man, I wish I could show up somewhere, be like, hey, I'm gonna make this awesome agentic AI thing. You should trust me. It's gonna be great. And then get $2 billion, right? Like, I mean, it's crazy, right? No product. And now, before they're even out to market with anything, they're valued at $10 billion. I mean, we've probably also heard about Friend, the little wearable device that you can carry around with you and interact with via text. Do we really need this? Do we really need something like this in our society right now? And it's couched as a solution to the problem of loneliness. If you want to be a little frustrated and angry, I recommend you look up Leopold Aschenbrenner. He's quite a character, not in the good way. He's fired from OpenAI after stealing information and then wrote this sort of strange screed about AI potentials and futures, and basically was given a $1.5 billion hedge fund. Again, must be nice. So I'd like to propose a slightly unorthodox idea here, in that AI is basically like a nonstick pan. So just like stay with me here for a sec, right? Have you all heard of PFAS? Yeah. So it's a combination of about 12,000 different compounds that are all known to be quite harmful to the human body. These have been present in industrial and consumer applications, honestly, since the 50s. So we find it in cookware, clothing, cosmetics, outdoor, and most notably inside our blood and inside our organs. So turns out these compounds are quite bad for human thriving and quite dangerous and cause cancer and other diseases. So evidence over the years is that it's harmful. Governments have reacted sclerotically and slowly to the issue. Only now are we seeing regulatory levels on municipal water. Only now are we seeing it being put out of certain products. I mean, it's kind of miraculous, right? Who doesn't like a nonstick pan, right? But convenience is the key factor here. And with AI, it's the same thing. We sell convenience, efficiency, less friction, quite literally. It's not acutely bad for us, but in the long term, it's quite bad for us, right? I mean, no different than with using AI. We don't yet know, we don't have the data on what the outcome is of exposing this technology to young children and seeing them through the education system. This is also a civilizational experiment, much like PFAS was, where suddenly you're rolling out Teflon to sort of everybody and everybody's using it and cooking in their home, only to later find out that it's incredibly damaging and very bad for us. Some of you might have also seen Sam Altman's statement recently regarding loosening guardrails. And this is what really set me off to this kind of idea. My favorite thing that he said was that now that we've been able to mitigate the serious mental health issues and have new tools, we're going to be able to safely relax the restrictions in most cases. Man, I gotta hand it to him. They did that fast, right? Pretty amazing. Who thinks that they've actually sorted it out, right? Have they actually fixed all the problems? I mean, I don't know. The thing about Sam Altman is he always gets in front of Congress and gets in front of the media with his sad puppy eyes and saying, yeah, I really wish you'd regulate us. Yeah, this is really bad. This is really scary. Yeah, like he's continually basically pulling us for a ride while marching on. I mean, he is the CEO of OpenAI. Sure, there's a board, but he has agency to change things. Yet he refuses to do so. Another person that came to mind in thinking about Altman in this degree was Wernher von Braun. Does anyone know who Wernher von Braun was? So Wernher von Braun is seen as the father of the US space race. He was a famous rocket scientist that unironically got his start building V-2 rockets that were used to blitz London during World War II. So he was the head of the Nazi rocket program. And what I found so disturbing, I remember reading this book in particular that cited his opinions on the moral neutrality of technology. He said that science does not have a moral dimension. It is like a knife. If you give it to a surgeon or a murderer, each will use it differently. So yes, sure, there are unanticipated ways in which technology will be used in unpredictable ways that can be very damaging. But the danger with concepts like this is that it gives legitimacy to those who create technology and create scientific methods that inherently harm people. It gives them moral cover to abrogate all responsibility for the actions that they take in creating a technology. So to me, OpenAI, Sam Altman, the ilk, are no different than Wernher von Braun, being able to conveniently couch that their technology is amoral. That sure, it might have some bad consequences, but it's not their fault. It's the fault of the people who use it. I'm sure if you asked the people in London who were bombed by the V-2 rockets, that they would have had something to say about that. So this will bring us to this concept of parallel authoritarianism. What we're seeing is essentially two tracks of authoritarianism appearing simultaneously. On one hand, we're seeing governments become less democratic and are less accountable to the needs of their citizens. Governments fall on some spectrum of overt tyranny to sort of a hybrid illiberalism, where the sort of skeleton of democracy still exists. On the other hand, we're seeing multinational corporations run by billionaires who are unaccountable to the public and essentially bypass government regulation. Generally, their needs are met before the needs of the public. In both cases, there's a contempt for the citizenry and electorate, and there's a coterie of unaccountable individuals who determine the futures of people's economic prospects and our societal thriving. We see both systems arising simultaneously, sort of enmeshed with one another, but in some cases also quite distinctly, and that's why I like to essentially separate the two concepts. So the first is type 1, the illiberal democracy or informational autocracy. So in much of the world, we're seeing fewer and fewer overtly violent fascist states or autocratic nations that don't necessarily need to resort to the same levels of violence and oppression, labor camps, etc. They still exist, but at least in the Western world, as we're seeing the slide into authoritarianism, we're seeing a much more sinister, sneaky version manifest. There's a lack of objective truth that tends to permeate these illiberal systems. Most opposition is described as malicious, fake, external, and there's an intent to distract the public as much as possible. Spectacle is essentially the effective tool to change people's attention rapidly from one thing to the other. I'll share the slides later at the end of the seminar in the Discord channel, but I highly recommend you check out Nureyev and Treisman's Informational Autocrats. This is sort of the first two professors that brought up this concept, and I find it extremely illuminating because it's the first instance in which I can see them distilling this concept in such a clear way.
Your display gets smaller at some point.
Oh, geez. I'm so sorry about that.
Really.
I don't know why that happened. Is that better?
Thank you.
Okay, thanks. I'm so sorry about that. Let me adjust this. Okay, is that all right?
Yeah.
Good, okay. So in a hybrid autocracy, there's just enough freedom to give off the trappings of democracy. Even if things aren't so good, people are willing to somewhat accept it, especially if there's a specter of fear in the air. You can look no further than the United States presently, and you see how the use of ICE as an essentially extrajudicial, unaccountable police force has created a sense of fear within the United States, right? That's a perfect example of a hybrid autocracy. You don't have an overt malicious force necessarily just routing up everybody off the streets, but they're targeting a very specific set of people. A little bit of dissent remains, right? And this is the fear of the 2026 election. If you can essentially maintain the existence of an opposition, it's very easy to promote the idea that democracy is still thriving and well. It's just that whatever ideas seem to permeate and perpetuate are more successful and are more supported by the public. In the US, despite our problems, you still couldn't get away with the electoral margins of, say, 98% that you have for someone like Lukashenko or Vladimir Putin. But in the US, when you have a bifurcated and polarized political environment that's always teetering on one end or the other, it's very easy to uphold an authoritarian state when you can point to the other side and say, well, if people only voted for them, they'd have more power. So elections end up being an illusion of civic participation, and there's the constant justification of the need for safety to limit people's freedoms. We look at Stephen Miller in particular and his financial stakes tied to Palantir. Now, I don't have as much time to talk about Palantir as I would like, but they're a frightening company. They have normalized the use of surveillance tools and data aggregation that has been used by militaries to commit all sorts of atrocities across the world, and now the tools are being weaponized not only within the United States, but within other Western democracies to essentially surveil and collect data that, in many cases, we don't know what governments will do with. The external tools of war, in essence, are then turned inward. And Stephen Miller is a perfect example of how there's a cycle of collusion between governments and their contractors. And this is not a new thing in the United States, but we've seen sort of a pivot, whereas it used to be Halliburton and weapons manufacturers and Lockheed Martin colluding with members of the U.S. Government. Now it's tech companies. And I hate to say it, but from this graph, we can see that Democracy Without Borders shows a diminishment in the democratic index, showing decreases in civil liberties and the degradation of electoral processes. An additional 8 nations have slipped into authoritarianism, bringing the total to 60. There's an essential aggregate sum decline in the stability of nations throughout the world for often many different reasons, whether it be a decrease in civil liberties, freedom of expression, or levels of overt violence and instability. I'm not going to talk much about this, but there's a great report that's released by Freedom House called Freedom on the Net. So this describes the sort of conditions that the internet has and what freedoms exist compared to year after year. So we're seeing that free expression has been diminished due to platform technologies furthering their control over expression, and especially seeing the cases where governments are able to essentially mold and modify the behaviors of those corporations to sort of benefit them. Instead of platforms being there to allow people to find ways to bypass surveillance or bypass a limit of expression, a lot of the times these companies are now supporting the ambitions of the governments to suppress free speech. So now we move into a different category of type 2 authoritarianism, which is known as techno-feudalism or rentism. Now, some of you might have heard, you know Yanis Varoufakis. He's the Greek economist who's become quite famed with his concept of techno-feudalism. He writes that profit drives capitalism and rent drove feudalism. Now that we have moved from one system to the other, this is because the new form of super-duper, all-singing, all-dancing capital, which is cloud capital and algorithmic capital. If I'm right, this is creating a new digital fiefdom, much like those of Amazon, Airbnb, where the main modes of wealth extraction come not from profits, but from rents. I'll get into this a little bit later, but you frequently see on shareholder earnings calls that corporations are dedicated most to improving the customer service and experience. Yet what did they do? They charge you for using heated seats in your car. They charge you to keep ads off of products that you've already purchased. You have an alarm clock. In order to get the bird sounds, you got to pay $4 a month. So we're seeing this sort of profuse sense of techno-feudalism take place in ways both great and small. Society is essentially reduced, in this case, to produce profit for billionaires and corporations. The function of a citizen is nullified. Essentially, the only role that a person has is to be a consumer. And I find that this language, in and of its own essence, is extremely damaging and destructive to our society. If you are simply reduced to a consumer, then there's only one thing you can do: consume or not consume. It's an extremely dangerous framing, and it's very, very normal for us to just think of ourselves as consumer advocates, or I have a right, I purchased this. It doesn't give us the sort of civic freedom to express the problems that are inherent within these systems. We only can work within what has been established in this asymmetrical relationship with a corporation. So humans essentially trade in their labor with automated systems, and said automated systems are then used to replace the labor of the workers. That is essentially the end goal of techno-feudalism, to be able to replace the very people that they originally employed to make the systems. The famous concept of privatizing profits and socializing losses is really the key to this form of authoritarianism. There's no real curative solution to issues of bias and harm. We trust that companies say that they're going to solve the problems within their own proprietary boxes, yet offer us no true insights into what they're doing. We don't ask or have the public forums to explore why these types of problems occur, and we have no idea what incentive they have to actually fix these issues if they would actually harm their own bottom line. So we've seen the familiar patterns of outrage, whether it be, Zuckerberg in front of Congress, or I'm sorry to make some of these references to the United States, but they are the most sort of glaring examples, or even Sam Altman recently in front of Congress. Companies get caught doing something bad, something abusive and troublesome. Media outrage expands. People on social media post. People are furious. They say they're going to cancel their subscriptions or stop using a particular service. Then these officials for the corporations are pulled in front of a governmental body or some other organization and held to account. And that being held to account essentially is a mea culpa for the CEO or members of a board to simply say, they're sorry, we apologize. We're sorry our planes fall out of the sky. We're sorry our social media platform is causing body dysmorphia and resulting in people wanting to kill themselves. We're so sorry about that. Any regulation that comes of this is usually so watered down that it's almost worse than if nothing had happened before. California, often the bastion of progressive legislation in the United States, unfortunately passed some recent AI laws that were so watered down that they essentially curtail more severe, more serious attempts at regulating the industry due to there being so many carve-outs and concessions made to the corporations in particular. So we see that bias and harm are essentially outsourced. And all of us who are on social media, angry, expressing our frustration with this particular issue, have nowhere else to go, because so many of the platforms are completely dominant and monopolistic. We have nowhere to go. There's also an insidious idea about efficiency. Techno-feudalism pushes this idea that our society is not efficient enough, that we are not fast enough, that we are not growing appropriately. So we have to ask ourselves, why is it that statistically, in almost every country, productivity has increased since the 1970s, and yet wages have stagnated? We blindly accept the economic imperatives that we need to produce more, and more often that we need to produce more from less. It's incumbent on us to train ourselves in AI so that we can output 10 times the amount of code, or 10 times the amount of content, or work 10 times faster. Each individual needs to produce more value. But who is it value for? So, I can't get much into Shoshana Zuboff's wonderful book, but if you haven't read it, it's called Surveillance Capitalism. Essentially, Shoshana Zuboff created the sort of magnum opus of understanding the origins of this particular economic model and its evolution into the modern age. And what's quite frightening about this book, it was written before sort of the AI arms race took off. And a lot of her predictions are very much coming true. She states that surveillance capitalism unilaterally claims human experience as a free raw material for translation into behavioral data. It is then declared as proprietary behavioral surplus and is fed into advanced manufacturing processes known as machine intelligence. It is then fabricated into prediction products that anticipate what you will do now, soon, and later. These prediction products are traded in a new kind of marketplace for behavioral prediction called a behavioral futures market. I have not heard it better described than that. And as you can see, I got very little out of this book. It doesn't really have any useful ideas much in it. I just like the colors. So there are 8 major facets that she describes surveillance capitalism, which very much aligns with both forms of hybrid authoritarianism and techno-feudalism. The first is the idea that we can claim human experience as proprietary. Nothing is off limits. Your movements, your purchases, your expressions, your driving speed, your opinions, your feelings, where you are, for how long you're there, why you're there. All of these are processed through opaque algorithms that make associations between these data points in a means to control your behavior. Secondly, we see a parasitic economic logic, which the production of goods and services is subordinated to a global architecture of behavioral modification. It's not so much what product meets a demand, but what product could be there at the right time to manufacture a need. This is also a rogue mutation of capitalism, marked by concentrations of wealth, knowledge, and power unprecedented to human history. The imperative of monitoring to then modify behavior, manipulate emotion, and to ensure compliance to desired outcomes of the few. This is inversion of Orwell's 1984. It's not chiefly the state surveilling, but a collection of unregulated, unaccountable corporations bound by very few morals being the ones who are controlling. She sees this as a significant threat to humanity, survival, in much the same way that industrial capitalism was to the natural world. This is also the origin of a new instrumentarian power that asserts its dominance over society and presents startling challenges to a market democracy. This is a renunciation of the social contract that was established by civil democracies. Corporations dominate and seek profits at all costs, regardless of the consequences. This is a movement that aims to impose a new collective order based on total certainty. The determinism of this economic model seeks to ensure profits are guaranteed at all costs, seeing only a means to extract. A perverse misuse of psychology is used to manufacture these outcomes. And finally, an expropriation of critical human rights that is best understood as a coup from above, an overthrow of people's sovereignty. Norms of democratic balance between the private and public sector are essentially dispensed with. Government actions are severely curtailed and demonized. Interests serve only the people, that they do not interfere with their profits. Some of you might have seen recently that the top 10 billionaires' collective wealth grew by $698 billion in the past year. And that this isn't isolated to America's super rich, but the global super rich are very quickly making our planet even more unlivable. To drive this point home, some of you might be familiar with Christopher Wiley. He's famed for blowing the whistle on the Cambridge Analytica scandal. He discovered and unveiled the unauthorized capture of data from 87 million Facebook users. And essentially this data was then used to manipulate social media posts to sway the 2016 presidential election. In reporting for Captured by Coda Story, the secret behind Silicon Valley's AI takeover, he describes waking up at a party in Dubai with many of Silicon Valley's elites. He was supposed to fly out to a journalism conference to talk about protecting democracy, but instead there were historic floods in Dubai. So he was basically trapped, and because of his connections was invited to a party with a number of very famed and expensive people. And when he called one of his colleagues on the phone that night, he said, "I don't know if you can hear me. I'm in the toilet at this event, and people here are talking about longevity, how to live forever, but also prepping for when people revolt and when society gets completely undermined." He whispered into his phone. You have in another part of the world a bunch of journalists talking about how to save democracy. And here, you've got a bunch of tech guys talking about how to live past democracy and survive. So this happened by accident. But really, are we surprised? Aren't they saying the quiet part out loud? Continue. You're wading through knee-deep water. People are screaming everywhere. And then, what do all these bros do? They organize a party. It's like the world is collapsing outside, and yet you go inside, and it's billionaires and centimillionaires having a party. Dubai right now is a microcosm of the world. The world is collapsing outside, and the rich people are partying. So this is all pretty bleak. And oftentimes we have to reach for art as a means of hope and expression. And I think of the great feminist author Ursula Le Guin, who wrote a tremendous volume of wonderful sci-fi novels. We live in capitalism. Its power seems inescapable, and so did the divine right of kings. Any human power can be resisted and changed by human beings. Resistance and change often begin in art, and very often in our art, the art of words. So essentially, to sum up how these two systems work together is introducing the concept of the politics of inevitability and the politics of eternity. Is anyone familiar with Timothy Snyder? All right, well, Timothy Snyder was a professor at Yale who recently fled to my homeland of Canada. He got an offer from the U of T and bit. And you know it's bad when the fascism professors are like, yeah, I'm going to get out of here. Things aren't looking very good. So obviously sparked a lot of fearful conversations with my wife and I about like, oh man, like when the fascism professor leaves, like should we leave too? But Timothy Snyder wrote a book called The Road to Unfreedom in 2018 that I highly recommend. Its focus specifically was on the 2016 presidential election, but also really looking at Vladimir Putin's Russia. He doesn't describe hypernormalization overtly, but he, in a very effective manner, is able to condense two patterns that are taking place throughout the world that took place in Russia. And he's able to then relate it back to his understanding of fascism and authoritarianism throughout the 20th century to pinpoint the problems we have in the West and how we need to address them. So first off, the politics of inevitability are essentially Francis Fukuyama's idea that history is over, that democracy is ascendant and permanent, that progress is a straight line, and that all we need to do is just keep going the way that we're going. What this does is it causes us to lose touch with history and lose touch with the difficulties of maintaining a society. The 5-day work week didn't just magically appear out of nowhere. It was through labor action. The 8-hour workday also didn't appear out of thin air. It took, in many cases, periods of sustained protest and bloodshed to win these rights for individuals. And what the politics of inevitability does is starves us of that history and that context. It makes us believe that simply things are just going the way they're going, and if something happens, yeah, we'll get back on the boat. We've all heard the word unprecedented an awful lot in the last couple of years. I think after the pandemic occurred, I think the word unprecedented was the word of the year. But this is a perverse concept where everything is unprecedented, everything is unexpected. Nothing is related to the system that's producing it. It's an ability for politicians and lawmakers to wash their hands of any responsibility in the problems. And eventually this becomes an inability to recognize the problems and their root causes. This then yields to the politics of eternity. And this picks up where inevitability leaves off. Manufactured crisis and outrage. As systems begin to collapse, people get angry. People feel they're losing touch. People feel like they're losing their economic and social agency. And what happens then is it becomes very easy to blame others, either people within your nation or outside of your nation, or to blame your political enemies. Eternity sees the failures and challenges of inevitability, and they become cycles of constant threat. They hearken back to these fascist ideas of blood and soil, that the promise and prosperity of our nation is threatened, that we must stand up and fight it, and that often an individual or a party will do that for the people. They don't need to fight to defend their democracy or their nation. The individual or the leader will. And this constant state of calamity is self-fulfilling. There's a failure to response to problems, which causes more problems that are then additionally poorly responded to. And think no further than libertarianism in the United States. I mean, boy, it'd be nice if you just didn't have to regulate anything and everything would work. I mean, I feel like anyone who supports libertarianism is basically kind of stuck at a 15-year-old level of thinking at that point. But it comes up that, essentially if you just let systems run, everything will work fine. You just allow the incentives to sort of drive themselves and everything will be okay. But things break down very quickly because nature abhors a vacuum. Simply not acting is no way to organize a society. Society rots. And anything that appears to counter the narrative of fascist decline is painted as false. So, will this kill us or save us? We don't know. What is the AI revolution bringing about? If we're thinking about a plot for a Star Trek or Black Mirror episode, these ideas of AI boomerism or boosterism, it may be, right? You're familiar with those concepts either. If you're a booster, that AI is going to cure cancer and solve problems and make our society utopian. I mean, even Elon Musk talks about universal guaranteed income, right? And alternatively, often in the same sentence, there's this incipient threat of AI technology potentially exterminating us. Now again, I personally feel it's not that likely that, AGI will suddenly appear in a Terminator form and we will be exterminated. It's usually the sort of mundane ways in which an AI technology could be implemented in a power grid, for instance, or implemented in healthcare, right? I mean, being a software engineer, we realize software is no safer now than it was five years ago, 10 years ago, 15 years ago, 20 years ago, right? There are always novel exploits, and AI is so new still that there's very little guarantee we can offer to its safety, especially in its deployment of critical infrastructure. So, Sam Altman. Booster or doomer? AI will probably most likely lead to the end of the world, but in the meantime, there will be some great companies. So, I think this gives you a lot of insight into the tech bro billionaire mindset, that even with the awareness of possible cataclysm, they're still more concerned with maintaining investment in their companies than they are the thriving of humanity. Right? When we develop superintelligence, we're likely going to make some decisions that the public market investors would view very, very strangely. I wonder about that. Now, I tried to avoid talking about Peter Thiel, because I really don't like it, and I really don't like him at all. Who's watched the most recent season of South Park at all, potentially? Okay, I know it's a pretty crass show, but I feel like it's really tough times. It's nice to have scathing satire. So here below you can see Peter Thiel. He actually dances and sings a little Broadway number about the Antichrist. This doomerist mindset, in some ways, is a smokescreen for fascism, right? It's the idea that, man, you got to look out for this potentially civilization-ending thing. That's the really bad thing. Be very afraid of that. Not the incremental slide into authoritarianism that we've described before. Not the small ways in which Palantir surveils you. Not the profusion of cameras in your community or of algorithmic decisions that determine whether or not you receive health care, that whether you receive social benefits, that even if you are applying for a job, that decide your agency as a human being. I recommend. I don't recommend you watch his interview on the New York Times podcast. But it gave you a lot of insight into his mindset, where Ross Douthat asked him, "You'd prefer that the human race endures, right?" And he paused. He mumbled a little bit in the way that he does. And Ross Douthat says, "You're hesitating." That's a long hesitation, man. Should the human race survive? And then Peter Thiel says, yes. And to round this out, Sam Altman's Manifest Destiny. I prep for survival. I try not to think about it too much, but I have guns, gold, potassium iodide, antibiotics, batteries, water, gas masks from the Israeli Defense Force, and a big patch of land in Big Sur I can fly to. This is well before ChatGPT was part of the public discourse, right? Altman's essentially inherited a Silicon Valley orthodoxy of overlordship, where they're not even trying to avoid cataclysm through sound policy or prudence. They're pushing right through and prepping, just in case things don't go well. So why on earth would we trust anything these people say when they're rolling dice with humanity? They seem to be more interested in building bunkers and hoarding wealth than attempting to solve the problems they are guilty of creating. They cling to apocalyptic visions of AI destroying the world and then retreating to New Zealand. So, I don't know. I think these guys are just weird and creepy, and I'd hardly trust them to babysit my cats, let alone run the world. And this dichotomy that they're forcing on us to think about the world either being potentially fully utopian or fully dystopian is really insufficient for us to sort of judge where we are at this point. I found one of the most influential books that sort of changed my frame of reference on looking at how technology evolves is Peter Frase's Four Futures. Has anyone by chance read this? Yeah, great. He essentially describes four potential futures waiting for humanity. And this isn't simply as to whether or not things will be doom or gloom or terrible or great. What he basically wants to establish is a set of principles to look for so that we can identify either progress in the right direction or progress in the wrong direction. I highly recommend you read it, and again with the slides there's a great introduction to his discussion. My favorite one of these potential four futures is the Star Trek future. This is egalitarianism and abundance, advancement, and what some call fully automated luxury communism. That's a really fun book and a really fun concept. It isn't what it sounds like. I mean, it's pretty great. It's basically autonomous systems and machines produce all of the needs that humanity requires, much like the replicator in Star Trek. There's free, abundant green energy, and everything works. This is where the future of humanity is set free from the constraints of wage labor, and we're able to pursue the interests and needs of the collective well-being. Slightly shittier version is the hierarchy and abundance outcome, which is rentism. And this one, given our current predicament, is frighteningly likely. Think of Blade Runner, billionaire technocracy, and subscription hell. You thought it was bad now, like them constantly wanting subscription for everything. Imagine walking down the street saying, oh, you have to cross the sidewalk, that would be $5, right? The notion that a few massive organizations that are either state or corporate or both maintain access to all of the resources. And in this case, resources are you, right? Imagine climate change advancing, imagine issues with mass displacement, and further consolidation within the tech sphere. Scarcity essentially dictates this particular future. Another potentially likely one, if we get our stuff together, is the idea of egalitarianism and scarcity. So this is a balance of power between corporate interests and public interests, greater interest in cooperation, and effective market planning. I remember being at a conference a couple years ago, and there was a lady who worked for the Dutch pensions department. And I will never forget her saying this, because I said, oh, it's so nice to be at a conference, and there's people who aren't just from corporations, but are from, the administrative parts of different European states. And she said, yeah, profit is boring. Line goes up, whatever. I want to solve some real problems. And I loved that sentiment because she was concerned with the needs of her community and how she could better use her skills to advance that. John Maynard Keynes penned The Economic Possibilities for Our Grandchildren in 1930. And in this vision, he stated, when the accumulation of wealth is no longer of high societal importance, there will be great changes in the code of morals. We shall be able to rid ourselves of the many pseudo-moral principles which have hag-ridden us for 200 years, by which we have installed some sense of the most distasteful human qualities into the position of highest virtues. We shall be able to afford to dare to assess the money motive at its true value. The love of money as only a possession, as distinguished from the love of money as a means to the enjoyments and realities of life. We will be recognized for what it is, a somewhat disgusting morbidity, one of those semi-criminal, semi-pathological propensities which one hands over with a shudder to the specialists in mental disease. I highly recommend you read John Maynard Keynes' vision, because you can see in so many ways in which we made substantial progress towards that vision. And yet in the last couple of decades, we've severely retracted. So much so that what he describes seems almost impossible. Finally, the worst case scenario, exterminism. This is where governments have essentially failed, society has collapsed, and techno-feudalism has reached its peak. The wealthiest live in areas least damaged by climate or war, or in space stations like in the movie Elysium. And human capital is no longer required to serve production. And this is what makes it so nefarious, and that people become superfluous because they are simply a threat to the limited resources that exist. And given our trajectory with tech billionaires, like Elon Musk, who just had $1 trillion payments package approved, we can see what direction, we can see the path to this particular future. But all right, let's put that down for a sec. That's quite bleak, that's quite rough. But if you read the book, what it does is it gives you a new frame of reference to understand the sort of deep concepts behind all of these in a history that has either yielded positive results and gives you the ability to then look at what's happening now and view it a little more clear-eyed. Originally, when he wrote the book, he was actually quite optimistic about the future, but saying that we do need to take deliberate action. And speaking of, what on earth do we do, right? I mean, how many of us feel generally powerless to make changes, right? This is really hard. We essentially have our ability as friends and family members, colleagues and co-workers, volunteers for a political campaign. Those things may seem small, but they actually matter, and they matter a lot. In the words of Frederick Douglass, the great American statesman, orator, and abolitionist, power concedes nothing without a demand. It never did, and it never will. So from here, there's about 5 things that I can offer that we do and that we focus on from sort of the corpus of the different authors and thinkers that have presented us. And I'll bring us back to Tim Snyder. In the end, though, freedom depends upon citizens who are able to make a distinction between what is true and what they want to hear. Authoritarianism arrives not because people say that they want it, but because they lose the ability to distinguish between facts and desires. This is sort of the focus of his politics of eternity and inevitability. We need to see between the lines and understand what's actually happening and what's being said to us and to push back against it. So for the first principle, don't be quiet. As in Tim Snyder's Tyranny, on tyranny, do not obey in advance. Don't accept narratives at face value and believe that everything that's told to you. And this is not to say turn into a conspiracy theorist and don't believe anything. Quite the opposite. As this conference pushes the idea of unlearning, it's really important for us to challenge the orthodoxy that we have judged big tech with, and also the orthodoxy that we've used to judge our own governments. The ideas of hypernormalization matter. The politics of eternity and inevitability matter. These allow us to see right through the facade of the system that is essentially upheld to guarantee profits for a very small portion of the population. Make sure, and this is no problem here amongst this crowd, but be an advocate for others, good tech, and good policy. Talk to your elected representatives. You know, in the United States, it's almost impossible. You can leave a voicemail, but in a lot of other countries, you can actually go and meet with your elected official. And honestly, too, if you can organize your friends, if many of you speak to a particular official, often that can move the needle in a direction, because the difference between hearing from 0 people and 1 person, or 5 or 10, makes a big difference. And most of all, call out big tech on its nonsense, right? All of this is prepackaged and delivered to us in this sort of numbing way. Sam Altman gets on the TV and pretends to care, and yet steams ahead with all of his policies and ideas for OpenAI. Call this out. Share it. Tell people that this is absolute nonsense and explain to them why. Because amongst us, we can all see it pretty clearly, but large parts of the general public don't. So it's important and incumbent on us to share what we know. Secondly, is that we need to organize. We have to take and find like-minded people and make our presence known. It's really important that we find ways to compromise with individuals we may not agree with. Especially when the stakes are incredibly existential, we need to find ways to create dynamic and strong partnerships. Now, of course, this doesn't mean that we should tolerate hatred or bigotry, right? We want to create broad coalitions of people who care about the same things. And I think of a great example of the No Kings protest in the United States. You're seeing a wide subset of the population, old and young, from different primary concerns, all showing up to want to advocate for American democracy and the restoration of a sense of sense and sensibility to our politics, to push back against the fascist backslide in the United States. Don't underestimate the power of local campaigns. It's very easy to be hyper-focused on large national movements and things happening with federal governments. But fundamentally, things in our local environment can often get swept under the rug. Important policy is often made at the municipal or state level, or provincial level for that matter. So keep a close eye on those issues, because very often you can actually have more power to influence those policies than, say, you would at a federal level. And again, challenge establishment political groups and push for reform. We just saw Zohran Mamdani succeed in an insurgent campaign to become a mayor of New York City. And my favorite thing was people asking, how does it feel to be the first democratic socialist mayor of New York? I'm not. Right? So many Americans aren't familiar with their own history, that there was this rich legacy of democratic socialists during the New Deal era, pushing and promulgating ideas that were beneficial for the full society. And of course, there were flaws and problems with the New Deal. It wasn't fully inclusive of everyone in American society. But we need to rekindle an excitement and possibility for insurgent campaigns that can potentially push us to a better future. And oftentimes, if you can see both sides of the mainstream media attacking an individual, it's quite likely they're the right person for the job. Do things in person. Now, this is a funny thing to say at a tech conference because we're all talking about technology, but it's really important. A lot of these technologies are designed to addict us and make us indolent and lazy, right? We often think that we're doing something by sharing something on Facebook or Blue Sky, and there's nothing wrong with that. I feel it's really important to be engaged online, and that these tools are really important for organizing people. Pretty much any movement or protest these days can't be put together without a strong online presence. That is essential. But you have to be in person. You have to put your feet on the ground, go to a protest, get together with people, show up to someone's office, whatever it may be. Just take whatever it is that you might be doing online into the real world, because then you can see a profound effect on actually advancing particular causes in a much more effective way. And again, grassroots activism also serves a purpose for us as people. It's very easy to be wound up in a sense of dread and anxiety and fear and honestly anger. You get into a fight with somebody on social media, and you feel that with the right facts and points you can convince them and they'll come around and they'll pertain to logic. And I mean, yeah, you might be talking to a bot, so like good luck with that. But you also might be talking to someone who's fully unwilling to listen to what you're saying. And we know people don't behave well on the internet. But face to face, there's a chance you might actually be able to get through to someone. I've noticed a lot of times, and my wife is often a little bit concerned, it's like, oh, don't go there with people, but I've had political conversations with people who are designated in the far right and Trump supporters. And yeah, there's some examples of people being pretty terrible to one another, but I have found cases where I've been able to break through to people, to get them to admit that, yeah, your candidate is really falling short of what he promised, and that, yeah, maybe what he's describing in the way seeing the world through this very simple lens of us against them is turning our society into an unlivable place. So it is possible. There's small little ways in which you can do this, but again, do what's comfortable. Second last is to delete and to refuse. If you can, don't use certain technologies and platforms. So much of the world has shifted in certain directions that this often becomes very difficult to do. But those of us who can live without Amazon.com, I mean, we used to, there's plenty of other retailers. If you can, why not? Do it. Clearly articulate the problems and advocate for why certain platforms and tools should not be used. Fight for the deployment of these technologies in your workplaces, schools, and communities. So in a lot of cases, if you have some agency over whether or not a particular AI tool is being used at, say, community school, or your child comes home and there's an assignment that works with AI. If you find that disturbing and troubling, make it known. Refuse to use this particular technology. Within your workplace, critically evaluate whether the tool that may be being put upon you is the right tool for the right job. Does it confer the proper efficiency benefits? Does it align with certain privacy standards? Does it actually make you more efficient? Speak truthfully about this. And then again, talk to people about why you shouldn't use something. A lot of folks oftentimes just let things slip into the background and don't think too hard about something. Say, oh cool, this ChatGPT thing's pretty neat. But a lot of people don't think further than that. They're like, wow, I can have a conversation with this Oracle thing. And they know very little about it. They don't know how it works. If you sometimes clarify a little bit more information about these things and kind of show the Wizard of Oz sort of behind the veil, then a lot of times people will come around and be a little bit disturbed about using this particular technology. And finally, support the freedom from and not the freedom to. This may sound a little bit funny, but we have a profound misalignment with what freedom means. We think the freedom means that we can do whatever we want, that we can buy a loud car and drive around loudly and play loud music or something, or that we can accrue as much wealth as possible. And that's really on us. It's not our requirement to have to support other people or support a civilization or a society, that we should be free to exploit people. But in reality, that's a very perverse mutation of what freedom actually is. And we can see this in a lot of the nations and countries that have better social welfare states and higher ratings of life satisfaction and happiness. I mean, look no further than the Nordic countries. I adore them. You see in a lot of cases, the main attitudes towards freedom are to have the freedom from certain oppressive modalities. True freedom means having freedom from hunger, from coercion, from economic precarity, from environmental destruction, from violence, from warrantless search and surveillance, and from oppression. So when you change the framing of what freedom actually means, it means a lot less about what you can do, but collectively what you can do for society, what people can do for one another, what a government can do for people, and what a corporation or business entity can do. We've lost the script here in that technology is seen as a zero-sum game of intense competition, and whoever makes it to the finish line first wins. This is not the way to succeed in a 21st century model for our society. And because I'm a huge nerd, Star Trek nerd especially, I want to close out this talk by referencing Mr. Spock. Some of you may or may not know Star Trek, but Mr. Spock is Vulcan. He's another species. Comes from a planet that the people basically govern their society through the tenets of logic and pure logic. So Mr. Spock is not particularly emotional. And unsurprisingly, the Vulcans are kind of like the Finnish, right? They're kind of quiet, reserved, very sensible. And one of Mr. Spock's most famous phrases is that the needs of the many outweigh the needs of the few. And in the Wrath of Khan, he sacrifices himself for the rest of the crew by basically giving his life to protect everybody else. So let's focus on finding ways that we can advance our technology, advance our society, and advance together, and focus on the needs of the many and not the needs of the few. Thank you.